Hello, I'm Ollie and this is CriminOlly, where I talk about crime, pulp, horror, that kind of thing. Today, as it's Christmas Day, I have a Christmas story for you written by me. So I've mentioned this a few times on the channel, but years ago, like 10 years plus ago, I wrote and published a couple of novels and a few short stories. And the most successful of all the things I published were a series of short stories about a cat. So that series is called the Cat Called Hope series. There are 5 stories in that series in total. One of which was like a Christmas special. So the first 3 stories need to be read in order. The Christmas one, which was the 4th story, is effectively a standalone and is a little side story about the cat at Christmas time. So given it's Christmas Day today, I thought I would read you that story. I have no idea how well this is going to work. I haven't done any reading of stories aloud since I used to read bedtime stories to my kid, and that was a fair few years ago. The story is about 7,000 words long, so I'm not sure how long this is going to take either, but we will see, and hopefully you will enjoy it. One thing to note before we start, so the cat, despite the books being called the Cat Called Hope series, the cat is actually called Marx. And the most of the stories in the series have kind of a bit of a thriller element to them. This one, being a Christmas one, leans heavily into the kind of schmaltzy side of things. So forgive me for that, and hopefully you will enjoy it. So anyway, here we have, for your listening pleasure on Christmas Day, A Cat Called Hope's Christmas Carol by Olly Clarke. Marx was alone, walking the cold, dark streets of the town. His fur had grown thicker against the ever-present chill in the air, and the flesh of his paws had toughened itself on the rough pavement. Layer upon layer of coarse skin built up by the miles he had walked. He knew that he had changed inside as well as out. His heart was stronger, his instincts sharper. Most of all, though, he felt less afraid. Around him, the human world was changing too. In the wider streets, the ones where no humans seemed to live, but they all flocked like mindless birds during the day, coloured lights had been hung from the tall metal lampposts. They filled the air with a twinkling glow that reminded him of the same nighttime stars that the human lights now blotted out. Similar decorations appeared in the windows of people's homes, shining welcomingly out into the night. Some homes carried them on the outside too, and then the cat noticed that these homes were often clustered together, as if the humans were competing in their colourful displays like birds during mating season. Marx didn't know the purpose of all these lights, couldn't tell if they were just a temporary thing or a permanent one. He knew better than to worry too much about what humans did, so he stopped thinking about them and just enjoyed the patterns they made in the air. Marx's routine had changed as well, now that he had to find his own food rather than having it provided to him. He slept in the daytime, finding small, out-of-the-way places to curl up in, and drifted through his dreams until the noises of the human world woke him again. One day it was the cold nose of a dog nuzzling his flank that brought him back to reality, and he lashed out with his paw before leaping away from the canine intruder. The dog let out a startled, sorrowful bark, and Marx almost felt sorry for him, but then his feline instincts took over. He didn't have much experience of dogs, but he had enough to know he didn't trust them. Most of the time his slumber was disturbed in less alarming ways, by loud, stinking lorries passing in the distance, by faraway shouts or bangs. Sometimes when he was woken, he would just look around to check there was no threat and then sleep again. More often he moved, partly to be safe and partly because he tended to wake restless. If his eyes were open, he needed to be moving, to see the cold, hard ground pressing beneath his paws. He didn't question this impulse. It wasn't his place to. So, in the day he slept because it made sense to. It was warmer then, and so it was only the noisy humans that woke him, not the chill from the ground seeping into his bones. At night he came alive, roaming, hunting for living food or the scraps that the humans left. He had never needed to fend for himself before, but the more he did it, the more natural it felt. Soon he came to learn that it was best to leave the human waste, because if he did, it attracted the kind of hot, tasty morsels that really sated his hunger. Small and grey or brown, fast, wriggling, but so satisfying when his paw crashed down on them and even more so when his teeth sunk into their flesh and sucked the warmth and life from them. He ate well, better than he ever had before, even if he had to work for it now. He missed having humans, but he enjoyed the sense of release that came from not having to worry about them and not being dependent on them. Slowly they became less and less important to him, no longer a defining part of his life, more just something to be wary of. So it was that the first time he saw the man, he didn't really give him any thought. He had moved to a different part of the town for no reason other than his legs and his feline desire to roam had led him there. In a change to his normal nocturnal pattern, he was exploring it by day, using the light of the morning to get a sense of the area and identify the best sources of food. His nose led him to an alleyway that ran behind a row of shops. It was sweet with the smell of rubbish. Not for the first time, he marvelled at all the food the humans liked to throw away. He could tell at once that the alley would be a good source of prey. Both the birds that would nervously drop from the sky to pick at the discarded food, and the mammals that would appear as if from nowhere, their whiskers twitching and their tiny eyes sparkling at the promise that the black bags held. There was no prey there now, but he was confident that if he waited it would come. His stomach growled at the thought of it, and he walked lightly into the shadows and dropped to his belly. The ground was cold and hard, and Marx tried to shut off the creeping feeling of cold that threatened to sink into him. He focused on his other senses, his eyes alive, his ears as hungry for sound as his belly was for food, his nostrils sucking in the cold winter air, and his tongue conjuring up the phantom taste of fresh blood. From this resting place he had a good view of the alley and of the street that had spawned it. It was in that tall, narrow window at the end of Marx's vision that the man appeared. He was old, older than most of the humans Marx had met anyway, and he walked slowly. There was no sense of frailty to him, though, and Marx got the sense that the slowness came from his heart, not his body. This was a powerful man, strong and proud, but somehow damaged. The cat watched him pass, and then his eyes caught a flutter at the edge of his vision, and he felt his heart leap as a small bird landed on the ground in front of him. Marx tensed his muscles to leap, forgetting about the man altogether. The next day he saw the man again. Marx was sleeping this time, in a damp-smelling box he'd found in another alley. The sound of shouting pricked his ears, and he opened his eyes and nuzzled his head out of the artificial darkness and into the outside world. The man was there, some distance away, but recognisable. It wasn't the first time he'd encountered the same human more than once on his travels, but it was unusual. Marx filed the information away in case it was useful in the future. The man walked a lot, but that was all he knew. He was strolling again, that slow, deliberate gait that seemed to be a purpose in and of itself. Marx heard another shout, and realised the slow man wasn't the one shouting. Slow, he thought to himself. That is what I will call him, if he even needs a name. A further cry came from the direction the man had come from. Someone he has been with, the cat realised, trying to stop him from leaving. Slow stopped and turned and called something back. He didn't shout, but his voice was a large one, and it carried to Marx's upturned ears. Unlike the shouting man, he didn't sound angry, just tired. He gave a dismissive wave of his hand, and then walked on, feet trudging over the cold ground. Marx backed away, headed down the alley away from Slow. There was something about the man that made his eyes feel cold and his teeth ache. Maybe it was just that he'd seen him twice. Maybe. He was sleeping in the same alleyway the next day, tired after a night prowling and hunting. He didn't know what woke him, but all of a sudden his eyes were open and his hackles were up and his ears were flat against his skull. He poked his head out of the box and saw nothing, but the rhythm of his heart told him that something was wrong. Marx walked cautiously to the end of the alley, still not knowing what had awoken him or why he felt so full of anxiety. Then he saw Slow and he understood. He was walking again, in the opposite direction than when Marx had seen him on the previous day, walking this time towards where the shouting man had been, and he wasn't alone. On either side of him walked younger men, matching his slow pace. Both had an air of menace about them, their bodies taut with a tension that Marx could feel even through their thick winter clothes. The silent scream that came from them rose in pitch with every step they took, as if the strain of walking so slowly was amplifying it. Together the three men radiated violence, filled the air with it, and Marx knew that was what had shocked his sleeping brain awake. Part of him wanted to turn and run, but there was something about the old man that intrigued him. Maybe it was just the coincidence of seeing him 3 days in a row. Marx didn't question it. He just went with his instinct, which was to follow. Cautiously, he stepped out of the alleyway and walked behind the 3 men, keeping a safe distance and hugging the walls of the house he was passing. They walked in silence, but with a sense of purpose that made Marx's heart race. His whole body felt alive like it did when he was hunting, ready to fly whenever, wherever his instincts told him to. The 3 men reached a house and stopped. Marx watched as Slow tiredly raised his hand and knocked loudly on the door. A face appeared at the window to one side of it, the expression on it quizzical at first and then suddenly alarmed. Slow knocked again, harder this time, hard enough to rock the door in its frame. Marx saw that his assessment of the man had been correct. His lack of speed wasn't due to any physical ailment. The door stayed shut and the man said something to his 2 companions. Without a word, one of them raised a foot and lashed it out, a heavy boot striking the door near the handle so that it bowed inward. He kicked again and again until, with a crack that hurt Marx's ears, the door swung open. There was a cry from inside and Marx recognised the voice of the shouting man from the previous day. He appeared in the ruined doorway, a long, thick, straight stick in his hands, and swung at the man who had kicked the door. His target stepped nimbly back, cat-like on his toes, and then grabbed for the stick. Mark watched his hands wrap themselves around the end of it and then push it hard back at the other man. The handle jabbed into the shouting man's belly and he bent in two, the air going out of him in a little white cloud that hung for a moment in the chilly air. Slow stepped forward and struck the man from the house across the face, rocking his head loosely on his neck. The man let out a sob of defeat and went limp, his hands hanging at his sides. Marx could see the fight had gone out of him. He looked like the rodents did when he had them cornered. Slow nodded and held his hand out. He waited, posed like that until the other man recovered enough to reach into his jacket and pull out a bundle of coloured papers that he handed over. As he did it, a woman appeared behind him and a child behind her. The woman spat something at Slow, who just shook his head and laughed as he accepted the man's offering. The child, a young girl, looked like she was crying. Marx didn't know what to make of it, but he had long since given up trying to understand human interactions. There was something about Slow that called to him, a tension that the man awoke in him that he couldn't ignore. He had met men of violence before, had seen the misery they brought. Slow was different, though. There was more to him than just spite. Marx didn't know whether one of his senses was telling him that in a way he couldn't completely decipher, or if some primal instinct was calling to him. It didn't matter. Whatever it was, he couldn't escape or deny it. The three men turned and walked from the house, leaving the family behind. Marx was torn for a minute, three paths battling in his mind. Should he run to the family and comfort the crying girl, follow the men and see what they did next, or forget them all? Curiosity won, and he found his legs carrying him after the trio. What was it, he asked himself? What drew him to Slow? As he walked, he looked back at the house. The family were turning back into it silently. No human walked to them to give solace, and no one followed the men as they walked away. Plenty of them watched, but none moved to do anything, just as they hadn't moved in response to the earlier violence. The men walked, confident and unchallenged, along the street, with Marx following unseen behind them. They maintained that same slow pace, and it felt now almost like a taunt to the threatened family and the passive bystanders. When they reached the corner, they turned, leaving the scene of the crime behind. Marx continued to follow them stealthily. On the next street, Slow knocked on another door. A man opened it and quickly passed a small white rectangle to him. That done, he ducked back inside again, like a mouse scurrying into its hole. Marx followed the men until he was too hungry to do it any more. They visited more houses and saw more people. There was no repeat of the violence, just a succession of broken-looking men and women handing over the small pieces of paper. The repetition didn't help Marx to understand what was happening. It just left him feeling sad for the humans and their confusing ways. He left the man walking with that agonising slowness, and as he ran, he realised that none of the houses the men had been to had the coloured lights they had seen in the other parts of the town. He pondered that thought for a moment, then put it out of his head and ran to a place he knew he could find fresh food, living food. He lost himself there in the hunt, and when his belly was full, he slept. When he awoke, it was dark, and he hunted again, catching a mouse and gulping it down before sleeping again in the darkness. His dreams then were filled with Slow, the steady tread of the feet on the pavement, beating like the heart of some giant creature. Marx turned and saw the man walking after him, twice as tall as a human should be, huge feet crashing down onto the pavement with increasing force. Rats and mice and insects scurried ahead of him, running for their lives from that terrible crushing tread. As Slow drew closer, Marx realised he needed to run too. His brain screamed at his muscles to move, but his forepaws were stuck fast to the cold ground by some force he didn't understand, and he realised he could no more run than he could fly. He watched Slow as he walked closer and closer. Those trampling feet kept his attention, but above them he also saw Slow's giant face lined with the streams of shining tears. When Marx awoke, his heart was racing, but this time he knew it was due to the memory of the nightmarish Slow rather than the real man's presence. He'll keep coming to me, he thought, unless I go to him, unless I stop him somehow. He resolved then to find the man, to observe him, to understand him. He needed to know him so that he could stop him. If no human was going to stand up to him, then he would, somehow. To do that, he had to find Slow, hunt him. Marx let his feet carry him back to the part of the town where he had first seen the man, and once he was there, he waited. He waited through the day until his stomach ached with the hollow pain of hunger that drove him to look for food. He ate and then slept. He ate and then slept again, and then it was morning and he was waiting in the street for Slow. When, at last, the man appeared, Marx followed him. He was alone, without the younger men Marx had last seen him with. He walked as slowly as he had before, and looked as disinterested in the world around him, like none of it really mattered to him. Marx followed at a distance, hugging the walls as he had before, his fur brushing occasionally against the rough brick. He kept himself as small as he could, ready to turn and flee if the man saw him, his legs full of the nervous energy he would need to propel himself down the street. Slow never turned, he just kept walking on obliviously. Marx found himself wondering if the walking wasn't the purpose rather than the destination. The man looked like he was roaming, exploring his territory. He marks it, the cat thought. Whenever he visits someone, he is leaving his scent, letting the other humans know that he owns the place. Each time the man stopped at a house, Marx watched him cautiously, fearing a repeat of the violence, but there was none. By the time the sun was high in the winter sky, he was too hungry and tired to carry on walking. He ran to an alley that he knew was a good source of scraps and tore one of the humans' rubbish bags open, too exhausted to hunt for fresh food. The meat he found inside had the start of the tang of decay to it, but his hunger overcame his caution and he ate it greedily before finding a place to sleep. Night was starting to fall when he woke, darkness falling quickly and heavily over the cold town. He'd slept for longer than he had wanted to and instantly feared that he wouldn't be able to find Slow again. His legs, strong from his rest, carried him swiftly through the streets, and his bright eyes scanned every human form looking for the shambling man. He found Slow at last, tiredly walking on the edge of what Marx had come to think of as the man's territory. He was walking away from the centre of the town, his gait more exhausted than ever. Wherever he is going, the cat thought, it isn't somewhere he wants to be. They walked for a long stretch, long enough that Marx started to feel tired again, the man leading the way, the cat following behind him. Not once did Slow look round, and after a while Marx grew bolder, walking closer to the man, near enough to smell the mustiness of his clothes and hear the rasp in his breath. Eventually he stopped, turning and walking through a small gate and up a path to a house. Marx noted that the grass on either side of the path was long, invitingly so, but he ignored it and focused on the man. Slow opened the door and walked in. Before Marx could react, he closed it behind himself and disappeared. The cat stood on the street watching and thinking. This was clearly the man's home. The shabbiness of the exterior suited him perfectly. A light came on and shining out into the night, and Marx saw Slow appear at one of the downstairs windows. The man stood in the centre of it and reached up, pulling together two hanging cascades of patterned material until they met in the middle, blocking out the light. There was no decorations here, Marx realised. He looked left and right and saw the coloured light shining gaily from the other houses in the street. Only Slow's was dark. Looking back at the run-down building, he noted that it wasn't completely devoid of light. Slow had blocked out some of the light, but not all of it. A glowing streak shone through a slight gap left between the curtains. Marx sprang over the gate and walked through the long grass. It stroked his legs and belly, and he stopped for a moment to nibble some, enjoying the fresh cold taste of it after the gamey meat he'd eaten earlier. The window Slow was behind had a thick sill beneath it, and the cat leapt lithely up to it, sitting there and peering into the house through the bright gap. The man was there alone, sitting in a threadbare armchair. There were other chairs in the room, but only that one looked used. Marx could see a thin film of dust on the others, a silvery coating that made them look almost ghostly. On the walls hung pictures, and these were free of dust, the glass that covered them catching the light and shining. All the pictures were of humans, he realised. 2 humans, both were female, one grown, the other a child. There was enough of a likeness between them that Marx could tell they were mother and daughter, and he thought he caught a glimpse of Slow in the girl's face too. They were a family, he thought, the 3 of them, but now there is only him. He looked at Slow, slumped in the chair, and then back at the pictures again. The colours in them were wrong, muted, faded. How long had the pictures hung there? Frozen moments of the 2 humans' lives for Slow to gaze upon. In some of the pictures the girl held a cat. It stared up at her face contentedly, and for a second Marx felt a pang of longing for human companionship. Slow stood and walked to the door, pausing by it to look at a picture of the woman and girl together. He lifted his hand and brushed his fingertips against both their faces, then quickly pulled a handkerchief from his pocket and wiped away the smudges he had left on the glass. Once he was satisfied the glass was clean again, he left the room. The man returned a moment later carrying a tall bottle half filled with amber liquid and an empty glass. He placed them on the table next to his chair and then sat heavily in it and poured himself a drink. Marx watched as Slow drank it down. With each swallow his body seemed to relax a little more. When the glass was empty, the man placed it back onto the table and began pulling from his pockets thick piles of the coloured paper people had given him through the day. He arranged them on the table, sorting them into piles of matching size and colour, smiling as he did it. That done, he poured another drink and swallowed it down as quickly as he had the last. From one of his pockets he took a small box, and from that he took a white stick which he put to his mouth, holding it between his lips. His hand went to the pocket again and pulled out a small metal object. Slow manipulated it with his fingers, causing fire to leap suddenly from it. He held the flame to the white stick until the end of it glowed. When Slow took the stick from his mouth and exhaled, his breath came out as a grey cloud. The cat sat there and watched this all, not knowing what to make of it. The fire and the stick and the coloured paper. It was the last that intrigued him most of all. Did it have some value to Slow? It seemed to please him somehow. The man kept sucking on the stick and breathing smoke until it had shrunk to a stub which he placed in a small metal tray on the table. He swallowed another drink and stared at the window for the first time. Does he see me? Marx thought. Does it matter if he does? Something changed on Slow's face and he stood, then stepped forward clumsily. His gait was different now, still slow but also unsteady. He approached the window and Marx sat firm, staring in at him until the man reached the window and crouched. He pulled the curtains open and stared out at the cat, their faces level, only the thin cold pane of glass between them. Marx saw now that the man's eyes were red, shot through with bloody streaks of crimson. The expression on his face was one of horror. He sees me now, Marx thought. After all the time I followed him, he finally sees me, but he doesn't want to. Slow's mouth opened and Marx heard a muffled sob through the glass. Those bloodshot eyes suddenly watered and tears streamed down his face. Marx remembered his dream, the giant, terrifying but sorrowful figure destroying everything in its path. Slow's jaw clenched, and all at once Marx was terrified of what the man might do to him. With more speed than Marx had ever seen the man exhibit, he spun from the window and ran from the room. There was a moment of silence, a frozen slice of time during which Marx was as unable to move as he had been in his dream. Then he heard a sound and turned to see the door of the house open. Slow appeared there, silhouetted against the light that streamed out from behind him. There was something in his hand, large, round. He swung it and Marx saw the silvery sheen of water flying through the air towards him. His instincts took over, banishing his paralysis, and he jumped from the window just as the water splashed against it. He ran from the house and Slow as fast as his paws could carry him. Marx slept fitfully that night, his mind filled with the sight of Slow's staring eyes. He awoke tired and restless and tried to lose himself in the thrill of the hunt, chasing an injured bird through the empty pre-dawn darkness until he finally managed to bring it down. His heart was racing as he snuffed the last of the life from it, and he decided then that this was the life he wanted, this wildness. The human world held nothing for him. Slow held nothing for him. He was best avoided. Marx kept clear of him all day, avoiding Slow's territory, deliberately staying in other parts of the town, sleeping and hunting and roaming. And yet as night began to fall, he realised he was on the same street that he had fled terrified along the night before. He was near Slow's house. What had led him there? When his brain told him he should be as far from here as possible, his body had brought him anyway. I need to see Slow again, he thought, to understand him. The man's house was easily identifiable by its darkness. He found it and slipped through the gate, laying in the tall grass to the side of the path and waiting. He dozed there, his senses half alert for Slow's approach, and when the man finally appeared, Marx was instantly awake. Oblivious to him, Slow walked up the path and opened the front door of the house. Marx shot through the grass, the long blades parting in front of him, and slipped through the open door before Slow shut it. Ahead of him was a long flight of stairs leading up into the darkness, and Marx ran for them, charging up them before the man saw him. Behind him he heard Slow close the door and enter the house. Marx turned in the darkness at the top of the stairs and saw the man remove his heavy coat and walk away into the house somewhere. Another light came on down there, and Marx backed away before the creeping brightness reached him. The upstairs of the house had an empty feeling, lifeless, as if no one had been there for a long time. Marx wondered if Slow lived only on the ground floor, accompanied by his photos and his drink. He walked through the darkness, his eyes adjusting to it and picking out the details. There were 4 doors off the corridor he walked along. All stood partly open. He entered the first and found the kind of room he knew humans did their toilet and groom themselves in. There was nothing for him here. The next door was of a similar size, filled with boxes that were stacked atop one another. Out of the top of one poked a bright, silky fabric. Marx sniffed at it, catching the smell of dust and age, but beneath all of that a faint floral scent. He left the room and entered the next. It was filled with a large bed, the sheets on it faded and unused. To one side stood a small table with a mirror on it. Marx jumped onto the table, his paws leaving little prints in the dust. There was some kind of brush there, and caught in its short bristles he saw a long strand of human hair. He sniffed at it and caught the same floral scent that he had detected on the fabric in the other room. Was it the smell of the woman from the photographs? He thought it must be, lingering through the years, a reminder of her existence. The last room had a bed in it too, but a smaller one, narrow and short and covered in bright pink sheets. There were animals in the room, or at least copies of animals, soft and furry, with small faces and large dead eyes. Marx felt a terrible emptiness in the room, a void which longed to be filled with life, but which wasn't. It is like everything good has been sucked out of this place, he thought. Not just this room, but the whole house. Where once there was happiness and laughter, there is now just Slow and his paper. It was no wonder the man didn't like to be in the house. Who would want to live somewhere where there was no life? Marx suddenly wanted to see Slow again, to try and bring him some solace. He padded down the stairs, through the hallway and to the door of the room where the man sat. He paused on the threshold for a moment, seeing in his mind's eye Slow's angry face glaring at him through the glass again. He could see the man in the chair, one of the smoking sticks in his mouth, his paper piled up again in front of him, and the glass filled again with the warm glow of amber. He was silent, his face morose. The room was as devoid of life as the rest of the house, despite Slow's presence in it. Marx pictured the places in the house he could run to if it came to that, saw all the dark corners where he could hide. Once they were locked in his head, he stepped into the room and meowed. Slow turned his head to look at him, and for a second Marx saw a smile there, a look of hope and delight. Then Slow closed his eyes and it was gone. Marx ran to him and sat at his feet, his heart beating hard within his chest. He meowed again, staring up at the man's blank face. Slow opened his eyes and let out a sob like the one he had uttered the previous night. He rested the smoking stick on the metal tray and reached a hand down to Marx, stroking the cat's head even as he started to cry. Marx nuzzled his face against the man's rough hand and thought for a moment that he had broken through the wall of sorrow that surrounded Slow. He tensed his back legs and jumped, aiming to land in the man's lap. Slow jerked back with alarm and swung a hand at Marx, knocking him back to the ground. The hard corner of the table dug into the cat's flank as he fell, and he let out a squeal of alarm, thrashing his legs. His back paws caught the already rocking table, and as he landed on the carpet he saw it topple. The items on the top of it fell, the paper spilling onto the ground, the glass emptying its contents. The strong-smelling liquid soaked into the paper, darkening it. Marx watched as the final item landed, the white stick. Its glowing tip touched the paper, and with a low cough the paper suddenly erupted into flames. Slow howled and leaped to his feet. Marx scrambled away from the man and the fire as Slow ran from the room. The man was back a moment later with the same round object he had carried the night before. He poured the water from it onto the flames, and they died immediately. Marx saw that where the paper had been was now nothing, just a smear of black ash. Slow turned to him and shouted, stepping forward. The cat ran, darting between the man's legs and out of the room. Slow span and followed, chasing, his footfalls sounding as heavy as they had in the dream. Marx reached the bottom of the stairs and charged up them, knowing he couldn't escape the house, but that he could at least hide. He expected Slow to run up the staircase behind him, but instead the man stopped at the foot of the stairs, fist clenched and voice full of rage as he shouted after the cat. Marx ran to the room filled with boxes and squirmed between them, making a cramped path until he was as far from the door as he could be. He lay there as quietly as he could, body shrunk in upon itself. He heard Slow calling again, more quietly this time, the edge gone from his voice. Part of him wanted to go to the man, but his still racing heart told him not to, and so he stayed where he was, enclosed and safe. Marx didn't mean to sleep, but he did, and when he woke the house was quiet but for the sound of Slow's snores drifting up from downstairs. Marx lay awake until he was sure he was safe, and then allowed sleep to take him again. The noise of the front door closing woke him. Daylight streamed from outside into the room, and he realised Slow had left the house once again to prowl the streets. Marx squeezed between the boxes and ventured back downstairs. When he reached the bottom of the stairs, the smell of fish hit his nostrils and made his stomach growl. He followed it and found himself in a small white room. On the floor in one corner of it was a small dish with glistening oily fish and another holding water. He ate and drank happily, his belly swelling pleasantly. On another side of the room was a tray filled with strips of paper. He ran to it and made his toilet, letting out a contented mew of relief. What did all this mean? Had Slow forgiven him? He walked back into the hallway and explored the rest of the ground floor, finding another bathroom and a small sparse room with a bed in it. On a cabinet beside the bed was another photo of the woman and child. Slow does live down here, he thought, and that's why he didn't chase me upstairs yesterday. He can't be up there. He can't bear the memory of them in anything other than these photos, these safe fragments of time. When Marx heard the front door open some time later, he sprang from Slow's chair where he had been sleeping and ran to it, rubbing himself against Slow's legs in welcome. The man spoke softly and bent to stroke the cat's head. Slow removed his coat and walked through to the kitchen, gazing with approval at the empty food bowl and crumpled paper. He took a tin from a cupboard and opened it, spooning more of the fish out for Marx. That done, he took his bottle from the cupboard along with a glass. His ritual that evening was familiar. Marx watched him drinking and sorting the paper that he pulled from his pockets. The man didn't smile tonight. Instead, his face looked troubled as he passed the paper through his fingers. He finished the job as quickly as he could, glancing up at the pictures on the walls as he did it. Whenever his eyes touched the woman or the girl, his expression changed again. Marx thought it was a look of shame. When Slow was done with his sorting, he patted his lap and Marx jumped happily onto it. He curled up and let the man stroke him, those rough hands running over his thick fur and soothing him. Marx felt his eyes grow heavy and knew sleep was approaching. The last thing he saw before it caught him was the smile on Slow's face. Marx awoke once in the night, still on the man's lap. Slow was sleeping, snoring softly, peacefully. Marx closed his eyes and joined him again in slumber. He woke again to feel Slow's hands lowering him onto the floor. It was daytime, and the man was standing, stretching to work out the kinks of sleep. Marx walked through to the kitchen and ate some more of the fish, then watched the man bustle about the house. He seemed different this morning. His face was transformed from its previous heavy blankness by a light smile that lit up those eyes and banished the redness from them. He moved more quickly too, with an eagerness that Marx had never seen in him before. The cat watched as the man stripped and then washed before dressing himself in different clothes. He went to the bedroom then, and from underneath the bed pulled a large case. He lay it on the bed and took a small silver key from his pocket. This went into an opening in the case, and Marx heard a click as the man opened it. When Slow opened the case, Marx saw it was filled with bundles of the coloured paper that had seemed to so transfix the man when he had first met him. Slow pulled the bundles out and weighed each in his hand, taking paper from some to put into others and laying them all on the bed in little piles. Through it all, Slow blew air from his mouth in a pleasing, tuneful way, making a lilting melody that filled the otherwise quiet room. That done, he left the room and returned with yet more paper, this time a stack of white rectangles and another of thicker paper, folded in half with a picture on one side. He placed these in 2 piles. Marx peered curiously at them and saw that the picture on the top of the pile was of a small brown bird with a round red breast. Slow lifted that picture up and then took one of the bundles of coloured paper in his other hand. He slipped the bundle inside the folded paper and then placed both in an opening in one of the white rectangles. That done, he lifted the rectangle to his mouth and ran his tongue over one edge of the paper before closing it up. The white shapes were thicker now. The coloured paper and picture of the bird had disappeared altogether. Slow repeated the process until all the coloured paper and pictures were gone, and all that was left was a pile of fat white rectangles. He stood and started placing them in the pockets of his jacket until each one was full. Then he walked from the room and returned with his coat on. The last of the white shapes went into the pockets of that, and when he was finished, Mark saw that his clothes now bulged from all the paper he was carrying. Before he left the room, he bent towards the picture by the bed and looked at the frozen faces that had watched his activity. He said something that Marx didn't understand, 3 soft words, then kissed the fingers of his hand and held them to the faces of his wife and daughter in turn. Slow walked to the door that led to the outside world and turned back to the cat. He blew through his lips again, a rising note, and patted his leg, smiling. Marx knew he meant for him to follow. The two walked down the street together. Whenever Marx looked up at Slow, he could see that the man was smiling. The name didn't seem right anymore, because Slow now had a spring in his step that made him look half the age he had the day before. It was a bright, cold day, and Marx saw that the sun was at its height, and yet the streets were quiet, quieter than he could ever remember seeing them. Slow stopped at the door of a house, and for a moment Marx thought he would knock on it, but he didn't. Instead, he took one of the white rectangles from his pocket and slipped it through a slot in the middle of the door. They walked together throughout Slow's territory, and the man repeated his act again and again until at last the shape of his clothes had returned to normal, and Marx judged that nearly all the paper must be gone. Slow stopped at a final door, and Marx realised it was the house of the man Slow had struck. Slow reached into his pocket and pulled out the last white rectangle, then lifted open the flap in the door. Marx saw a face appear at the window by the door, the girl he had seen before. Slow saw her too and froze. The girl's mouth moved as she called something to the others in the house. Before Slow could slip the paper through the door, it opened, and there stood the house owner. He started to shout at Slow, and then took in the paper in his hand and the cat at his feet. Slow said something, quietly, gently, and passed the man the paper. The man took it and tore it open. Seeing the contents, his mouth dropped open, and he turned and called into the house. His wife appeared, the girl by her side. She looked afraid at first, but then the man spoke to her, and so did Slow, and her expression softened. The girl stooped to stroke Marx, and he purred softly, enjoying the attention, and then all 3 of the adult humans were moving. Marx thought at first that Slow would walk away from the house, and he felt sad as he wanted to spend time with the girl. Then he realised that the couple were ushering the man into their home. Slow paused at first. His face flushed red, and he mumbled something. Marx saw the man take his arm gently and pull Slow forward with a smile of encouragement. Slow's face cracked into a grin, and Marx noticed that his eyes shone with tears as he walked into the family's home with the man and woman. The girl bent and clumsily picked Marx up, carrying him into the house. As she did, the cat felt the happy atmosphere of the place surrounding him, the warmth and smell of roasting meat. It was a house full of life, a place of hope. So I hope you enjoyed that, and that you have, or have had, a very happy Christmas. Cheerio.